You asked which parts of the oral law were passed to Moses and what was passed directly to Israel. So there is some discussion about this in the oral tradition. The majority opinion is that the entire Jewish nation only heard the first two of the 10 commandments from God himself. That is, they heard, I'm the Lord your God, you should know other gods before me. Then they heard God call Moses up to the top of Mount Sinai to receive the rest of the written and the oral traditions. And then the rest of the story is very famous. Moses descended, beams of light radiating from his face. He had these levitating tablets that floated in his arms that were engraved on both sides with the 10 commandments. Miraculously, one engraving showed the same text on both sides. When Moses came down in this miraculous form, glowing, he immediately wrote down the entire Pentateuch, the entire 5 books of Moses, as one contiguous stream of letters, no spaces. And he only put the spaces between the words in the first book and a half, that is, starting from the creation of the universe, all the way up to the story of Moses coming down from Mount Sinai with the 10 commandments. That he spaced as he wrote it out. All the rest of the Pentateuch remained just letters, unspaced. Now, as they traveled through the desert and events transpired, then Moses added spaces, and behold, the verses now describe the events that just transpired. So the verses became comprehensible, and they described past events, or they described laws. Now, simultaneously, meaning from the moment that Moses came down, Moses taught the oral tradition to his students, and he pointed to the letters in the Pentateuch and connected them to the letters, connected the oral tradition to the letters of the written tradition, so they could see how this set of lecture notes, the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, hinted to the oral tradition. And of course, once there were spaces, then he could also use textual anomalies in the sentences in order to hint to the oral tradition. And so again, I just want to make clear, so there's really 2 things that are happening. There's the written tradition, which is letters primarily at the beginning, and then some sentences. And then there's the oral tradition, which is Judaism. And Moses is teaching them the oral tradition and then pointing where you find hints of this oral tradition in the written text. The students who received this from Moses passed it on to the next set of students. It started really with the elders, and then the elders gave it over to their closest students until eventually the entire Jewish nation got each one of these lessons from Moses. That's what they were doing in the desert, was they were learning the oral tradition and passing it very quickly through the Jewish nation. The transmission of the written and the oral traditions to the Jewish nation was only entirely complete at the end of Moses's life. Okay, now I just want to address a potential problem, which I'm sure occurred to you. It might even be underlying your question. Given that Moses was the only one who ascended to the top of Mount Sinai, so it really begs the question of his reliability. Perhaps Moses innocently erred. And if Moses erred, there's no way to correct that, because it's not like you can go after the majority of rabbis and go ask them. There's only one rabbi who's bringing this information down. And I mentioned before, the Torah rejects the concept of rabbinic infallibility. We believe that rabbis can make mistakes. I'll go even further. Orthodox Judaism is built on the assumption that rabbis can and do make mistakes. And simultaneously, there are mechanisms for identifying and correcting those errors. Okay, but those mechanisms, cross-checking those mechanisms don't exist for Moses since he was alone on Mount Sinai. So there's a real problem here. And the tradition says that precisely for this reason, Moses is, in a way, I'll explain how, but in a way, the exception to the rule of fallibility. Practically, Moses did not err in his transmission of the written oral traditions. It would have been disastrous if he erred, because there'd be no way to correct it and mankind would be lost. The Torah that we received at Mount Sinai wouldn't be reliable. But his accuracy is not because he couldn't err. Moses could have erred. But again, coming back to this concept, because God is outside of time, God knew before he ever created Moses what decisions Moses would make. And again, this isn't because Moses didn't have free will. Moses did have free will. But God sees past, present, and future simultaneously. And had Moses been headed for an error, had that been where he was going to go, then God would never have placed him in that time and place in history. He wouldn't have dropped him into that generation. A different prophet who wouldn't err would have brought the Torah down to the Jewish nation. So God ensured the accuracy of Moses' transmission through his presence outside of time, and knowing that Moses practically didn't err when he transmitted.